My name is Arthur Penn. I hold a doctorate, or rather, a doctorate in abeyance, in the field of ethnobotany, with a secondary focus on the folklore of the American West. For the past 6 years, my life was a cloistered one, defined by university archives, grant proposals, and the quiet, often vicious, politics of academia. A professional and personal rupture, the details of which are both tedious and irrelevant, prompted a need for a drastic change. I required solitude. I required a landscape that was honest in its immensity and indifference. I required a task with clear, tangible objectives. It was with this mindset that I formally accepted the position of forestry technicians. Lookout, GS 05, with the United States Forest Service. My assigned post was Tama Lookout, a remote, seasonally staffed tower in the Flathead National Forest of Montana, a stone's throw from the jagged spine of Glacier National Park. The job description was a masterpiece of bureaucratic understatement. Uses standard firefinders to locate observed smoke. Reports azimuth, distance, location, volume. Maintains records and logbooks. It was, on paper, the perfect antidote to my previous life. 100 days of paid isolation, a chance to clear my head and perhaps, I thought, to observe the intersection of man and wilderness from a unique vantage point. I was a scholar, after all. Observation was my trade. The journey to the tower was a process of shedding, a gradual sloughing off of the civilized world. It began with the drive from Kalispell, the roads narrowing from pavement to gravel, then to a deeply rutted track that was more suggestion than road. At the Tally Lake Ranger District Station, I received my final briefing from a man named Henderson, a career USFS employee with a face like a topographical map of the very region he managed. He handed me a standard issue radio, a set of keys, and a look that was equal parts encouragement and pity. "It gets quiet up there, Dr. Penn," he'd said, pointedly not using my preferred, less formal address. "Real quiet. Some folks aren't built for it." The final leg of the journey was a 5-mile hike, a strenuous ascent that took me from the lower montane forests of ponderosa pine and Douglas fir into the subalpine zone. The air grew thin and sharp, smelling of pine duff and cold stone. The world of engine noise and human chatter fell away, replaced by the sighing of wind through western larch and the chittering of unseen squirrels. The path was steep, and my 45-pound pack, mandated by the service, felt like an anchor. But with every step, a layer of my old life seemed to dissolve. By the time I broke through the tree line and saw the tower for the first time, I felt scoured clean, a blank slate. It stood on a rocky promontory, a stark, functional structure against the endless blue. Tama Lookout was a classic L4-style ground cab, a 15 by 15-foot wooden room built in the 1930s. Perched on a short foundation, rather than a towering steel frame. It was encircled by a narrow catwalk, its windows offering the promised 360-degree view that was so staggering it bordered on the sublime. From this single point, I could see tens of thousands of acres of wilderness, a rolling sea of green and gray, punctuated by the glint of distant alpine lakes. The sheer scale of it was humbling, a physical weight on the senses. It was peaceful, Yes, but it was also a profound and unnerving exposure. There was nowhere to hide. The interior was Spartan and smelled of old wood, propane, and mice. A single bed was bolted to one wall, a small desk to another. A propane stove and fridge hummed quietly in a corner, and a thick, legged wooden stool, the infamous lightning stool, insulated with glass feet, sat ominously in the center of the room. Power for the vital radio equipment came from a solar panel on the roof. But the heart of the room, the reason for its existence, was the Osborne Firefinder. As an academic with a fondness for antiquated technology, I was immediately captivated. It was a beautiful piece of equipment, a large, circular brass table with a meticulously detailed topographic map of my assigned territory sealed under a glass plate. In the center pivoted the alidade, a sighting mechanism with a fine horsey hair crosshair in the front sight and a narrow slit in the rear. By aligning these on a distant smoke, I could read the exact azimuth, the compass bearing, from the graduated ring on the table's edge. It was technology from the 1840s, a testament to elegant, enduring design. I spent the first afternoon familiarizing myself with its operation, performing the daily checks I'd been taught, leveling the base, checking the plumb of the horsehair, sight against a weighted string, and orienting it to a known peak on the horizon. It was a ritual, a connection to the generations of lookouts who had stood in this very spot, their eyes scanning the same vast wilderness. It was while organizing the small desk that I found the anomaly. Tucked inside the back cover of a new, official USS logbook was a single sheet of paper. It was thick, high-quality government stock, but yellowed and brittle with age, as if it had been transferred from logbook to logbook for decades. It was typewritten, the letters faint and slightly misaligned, on a machine that had clearly seen better days. At the top, in stark capital letters, was the title UNOFICIALADDNDUM. Opuratingprocedures locat. I read it with a growing sense of bemusement, a smile tugging at my lips. It was clearly a prank, a piece of accumulated cabin fever, induced folklore, left by a predecessor with a dark sense of humor. In my own research, I'd come across countless tales of isolation, induced madness. This was just a prime example, a local legend in the making. I smoothed the paper out on the desk. 1. Conduct horizon scans every 15 minutes from sunrise to sunset. After sunset, do not look directly at the horizon. Observe it only through reflections in the window panes. 2. Log all weather data at the top of the hour. If the anemometer spins counter clockwise, do not record the wind speed. Report calm conditions to dispatch, regardless of the truth. Do not look outside for the next 10 minutes. 3. The radio is for official use. If you hear what sounds like a lullaby or quiet weeping on the air guard frequency, 168.625 Mets, turn the squelch to maximum and do not respond. It is not for you. 4. You may occasionally see a single, unmoving figure at the distant tree line, near the old growth of western larch. This is normal. Do not log it. Do not point the firefinder at it. He does not like to be measured. 5. If you hear scratching at the trapdoor to the catwalk, ignore it. The sound will be that of a badger or porcupine. It is never a badger or porcupine. 6. Some nights, the stars will seem to go out. This is an atmospheric effect. Do not light the lantern. Sit on the insulated stool and wait for them to return. Do not count the time that passes. 7. Never, under any circumstances, consume the wild strawberries that grow in a perfect circle around the base of the tower. They are not for you. I chuckled, folding the paper and tucking it back into the logbook. The rules were cleverly constructed, each one playing on a specific aspect of the lookout's life. The radio frequencies, the weather equipment, the local flora and fauna. It was an impressive piece of creative writing. I felt a strange kinship with the anonymous author, another soul, who had found themselves alone on this peak with too much time to think. My first official watch began the next morning. The world was painted in the soft pastels of dawn. I followed my training, my eyes sweeping the horizon in a slow, methodical 360-degree scan, a practice I would repeat every 15 minutes. I made my first radio call to dispatch, keeping my language professional and concise, just as Henderson had instructed. Kalispell Dispatch, this is Tama Lookout. Radio check over. The reply was crisp and clear, a reassuring tether to the world below. I felt a sense of profound peace, a feeling of purpose I hadn't known in years. This was real. This was meaningful. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges, I stepped out onto the catwalk to take my 1800 weather reading. The air was cool, and a steady breeze was blowing from the west. I noted the temperature and humidity, then glanced up at the anemometer, a small device with 3 cups that spun to measure wind speed. As I watched, the cups slowed, stopped, and then, for 3 full rotations, spun distinctly counter-clockwise. I blinked, shaking my head. It must have been a trick of the light, or a sticky bearing in the mechanism. I waited. The cups stuttered again, then resumed their proper clockwise rotation. I laughed it off, my mind immediately recalling the absurd second rule. Report. Calm conditions. Do not look outside for the next 10 minutes. A charmingly specific detail for a prank. I dutifully recorded the correct wind speed and direction in my logbook, making a mental note to oil the anemometer's housing in the morning. I turned to go back inside. As my hand touched the door, a sudden, violent gust of wind slammed into the tower. It wasn't a natural gust. It was a physical blow, a solid impact that made the entire structure groan and shudder on its foundation. The windows rattled in their frames, and I instinctively grabbed the railing for support. From inside the cabin, the radio, which had been quietly humming, erupted. It wasn't the usual hiss of atmospheric noise. It was a single, sharp burst of static, loud and abrasive. But beneath the noise, for just a fraction of a second, it sounded like something else. Something organic. It sounded like a sharp, shocked, indrawn breath. I stood frozen on the catwalk, the wind whipping my hair across my face. The radio fell silent. The world was still again, save for the gentle, natural breeze. I stared at the door to my new home, the laughter gone from my throat, replaced by a cold, heavy knot in the pit of my stomach. It was just the wind, I told myself. It was just static. It was a long summer ahead, and I was already letting the isolation get to me. But as I finally pushed the door open and stepped back into the dimming light of the cabin, my eyes were drawn to the logbook on the desk and the yellowed sheet of paper tucked within. And for the first time, it didn't feel like a joke at all. The first week at Tama Lookout passed in a state of sublime, deliberate monotony. The initial shock of that first evening, the reversed anemometer, the violent gust, the strangled gasp from the radio, subsided into a nagging unease, an itch at the back of my mind that I consciously chose to ignore. I was a scientist. I dealt in observable, repeatable phenomena. A faulty bearing, a pressure differential, a stray radio signal bleeding over from another frequency. These were rational explanations. To entertain anything else was to succumb to the very isolation induced paranoia I had read about in countless psychological studies. My days fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the Forest Service manual. Every 15 minutes, from the first hint of dawn until the last ember of sunset faded from the sky, I performed my sweep. I would stand at the Osborne fire finder, my feet on the exact spot worn smooth by my predecessors, and slowly pivot, my eyes tracing the vast panorama. I learned the landscape, memorizing the shapes of the peaks, the contours of the valleys, the subtle variations in the color of the forest that could signal a change in health or humidity. It was a landscape of profound indifference, a geological timescale unfolding before me, and I, a fleeting observer, was tasked with watching for the ephemeral flicker of a flame. I logged weather data, maintained the equipment, and kept my radio calls to dispatch brief and professional. The yellowed list of rules remained tucked in the logbook, a piece of forgotten folklore I refused to consult. It was on the 8th day during my 1430 scan that I saw him. My gaze was sweeping past the dense, old-growth stand of western larch to the northeast, a patch of forest noted on my map for its age and vulnerability to lightning strikes. And there, at the jagged edge where the dark timber met a slope of pale green meadow, was a figure. It was undeniably a man, though at this distance, several miles at least, details were impossible. He was simply a dark, vertical shape against the trees, perfectly still. My training kicked in instantly. An unauthorized person in a remote sector, a potential fire risk, a lost hiker. My first duty was to get a precise location. I leaned over the Osborne fire fender, my hands instinctively moving to align the sights. I centered the brass alidade, my eye seeking the rear slit, preparing to line up the horsehair crosshair on the distant shape. It was a standard procedure, one I had practiced dozens of times. And then I froze. A cold dread, sharp and specific, washed over me. Rule number 4. You may occasionally see a single, unmoving figure at the distant tree line. Do not log it. Do not point the fire finder at it. He does not like to be measured. My mind reeled. It was absurd prank. A test of some kind, perhaps, left by a predecessor to see if the new lookout was prone to suggestion. Yet, the memory of that first night was still vivid. The shudder of the tower, the sound on the radio. My job, my entire purpose for being here, was to observe, to locate, to measure. this rule was a direct contradiction of my most fundamental duty. I stood conflicted, my rational, academic mind at war, with a primal, superstitious fear I hadn't known I possessed. I was a scholar of folklore, not a participant. I had studied the Kootenai and Salish legends of this very region, tales of Coyote the Trickster, and the Nativisu Lixintine, the people-eaters, who roamed the land before humans. They were fascinating cultural artifacts, not field guides. My hand trembled slightly as I pulled it back from the fire finder. I took a deep breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. I would compromise. I would observe, but I would not measure. I raised my binoculars to my eyes, the powerful lenses bringing the distant tree line into sharp focus. I scanned the area where the figure had been standing. There was nothing there. Only the trees and the meadow, shimmering in the afternoon sun. I scanned back and forth, my grip on the binoculars tight. He was gone. It was impossible. No person could have moved that quickly, disappearing back into the dense forest in the few seconds my eyes were off him. I lowered the binoculars, a cold sweat on my brow. Had I seen him at all? Was this what Henderson meant? Some folks aren't built for it. That night, sleep offered little respite. The wind moaned around the corners of the cabin, a lonely, desolate sound that seemed to carry voices, just at the edge of hearing. I found myself thinking of the old logbooks, stored in a footlocker beneath the bed. They were official government property, decades of meticulous records of weather, fires, and supply drops. But perhaps they held more. Perhaps a previous lookout, another academic or a lonely soul, had left some clue, some explanation for the unofficial addendum. The next day, during a long, quiet afternoon with no sign of smoke, I pulled them out. They were heavy, bound in canvas, their pages filled with neat, economical script. I started with the most recent and worked my way back through the 1970s, the 60s. It was a history of the mountain in miniature. Decades of lightning strikes, smoke reports, and mundane observations. July 12, 1968, resupply packer brought mail and fresh eggs. Good to talk to someone. August 3, 1975. Major lightning storm over the Swan Range. Plotted 32 strikes. No smoke yet. It was in a logbook from 1958 that I found the first crack in the official record. The handwriting was different from the entries before and after it. Tighter, more frantic. The entry for September 2nd read: anemometer spinning backwards again. Wind from the east, but the cups say west. Radio made the breathing sound. I'm not reporting it. A few pages later, another entry. His out there again. Same spot. Just watching. I will not use the finder on him. I will not. The final entry from that lookout, dated September 18th, was almost illegible. Scratching all night. God, the scratching. After that, a new handwriting appeared, noting that the previous lookout had left his post for personal reasons, and a replacement had been brought in. I sat back, the dusty logbook open on my lap. This wasn't a prank. It was a warning, passed down through decades. My scientific detachment was gone, replaced by chilling sense of validation. I was not the first. That evening, I felt a new kind of dread settle over me. The setting sun no longer felt peaceful. It felt like a countdown. As darkness enveloped the tower, I turned my attention to the radio, the lifeline that connected me to the world below. I kept the volume low, the quiet hiss a familiar companion. I was monitoring the standard channels when a thought, cold and unwelcome, slithered into my mind. Rule number 3. If you hear what sounds like a lullaby or quiet weeping on the AirGuard frequency, AirGuard 168.625 MHz, was the National Emergency Aviation Channel. It was to be monitored continuously by all federal aircraft, used only for mayday calls or other dire situations. It was a channel you prayed you never had to use, and one you certainly didn't expect to hear anything on during a quiet night. My training dictated that any unauthorized transmission on that frequency was a serious event, to be reported immediately. With a sense of morbid curiosity, I couldn't resist. I switched the radio's channel group and tuned to AirGuard. The speaker emitted the normal, empty static of an open channel. I listened for a minute, then another. Nothing. I felt a wave of relief, foolish for even checking. I was letting the old logbook get to me. I reached to switch back to the dispatch frequency, and then I heard it. It was faint, buried deep in the static, but it was there. A melody. It was a simple, childlike tune, a lullaby played on what sounded like a tinny music box. It played through once, then twice. The sound was so profoundly out of place, so alien to the world of emergency, radio protocols and wilderness silence, that it made the hair on my arms stand on end. Then, the music box faded and was replaced by a new sound. The sound of a woman, quietly weeping. It wasn't a sound of frantic grief, but of deep, bottomless sorrow. A sound that seemed to seep into the very wood of the cabin. My blood ran cold. This was a breach of federal communication protocols. Someone was in distress. My duty was clear. I had to respond. I had to report it. My hand reached for the transmit button. Turn the squelch to maximum and do not respond. It is not for you. The words of the rule screamed in my head. It is not for you. The weeping continued, a heartbreaking, ghostly sound floating through the ether. My training, my sense of duty, my entire professional ethos warred with the stark, insane instruction on that yellowed paper. I thought of the frantic entries in the 1958 logbook. I thought of the figure who was there, one moment and gone the next. With a shaking hand, I reached for the squelch knob. The control was designed to filter out background noise, to keep the radio quiet unless a strong signal was present. Turning it to maximum would effectively deafen the receiver to anything but the most powerful, close, range transmission. I twisted it. The weeping cut off instantly, replaced by a profound and absolute silence that was somehow more terrifying than the sound it had replaced. I sat there in the dark, in my glass box on top of the world, utterly alone. The vast, star-dusted sky outside the windows offered no comfort. It felt like a cage. I was no longer an observer. I was a prisoner. And the rules were not a joke. They were the bars of my cell. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that something was coming to test them. The silence that followed my act of obedience, twisting the squelch knob to maximum, was more profound and terrifying than any sound it had replaced. The weeping on the air guard frequency had been an intrusion, a violation of the natural order of my isolated world. But its absence was a vacuum, a void that my mind rushed to fill with horrors of its own making. For the first time since arriving at Tama Lookout, I felt the true weight of the 100,000 acres of wilderness pressing in on all sides. It was not empty space. It was a space filled with a waiting, watching presence. My academic detachment had been a flimsy shield, and it was now shattered. I was no longer a scientist observing a phenomenon. I was prey hiding in a glass box, learning the rules of a game I never agreed to play. The next few days were a blur of hyper-vigilance. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford, snatched in brief, anxiety-ridden increments. Every gust of wind, every creak of the tower's old timber sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I performed my duties with a frantic, mechanical precision, my horizon scans no longer a peaceful ritual, but a desperate search for threats. I kept my radio transmissions, with dispatch clipped and professional, my voice a strained imitation of my former self, terrified that some other, unwanted sound might bleed through. The yellowed list of rules was now my Bible and my curse, permanently left open on the desk next to the official logbook. I read and reread the lines, searching for patterns, for loopholes, for some hint of the logic that governed this place. I was a scholar, and this was the most important text I had ever studied. On the third night after the radio incident, the scratching started. It began subtly, a faint, rhythmic scraping against the underside of the catwalk near the trapdoor that provided the only access from the ground. My heart leaped into my throat. I froze, straining my ears in the oppressive silence of the cabin. It sounded like a branch skittering across the wood in the wind. But there was no wind. The air was unnervingly still. Rule number 5. If you hear scratching at the trapdoor to the catwalk, ignore it. The sound will be that of a badger or porcupine. It is never a badger or porcupine. The memory of the 1958 logbook entry flooded my mind. Scratching all night. God, the scratching. The sound came again, louder this time. It wasn't the frantic scrabbling of an animal's claws. It was a slow, deliberate, dragging sound. A heavy grit, like stone being pulled across wood. Then came a series of sharp, distinct taps on the trapdoor itself. Tap, tap. Every instinct screamed at me to look, to crawl to the edge of the catwalk, peer over the side, and confront the source of the noise. My entire being was a coiled spring of fight or flight, and the inability to do either was a unique form of torture. I backed away from the door, my eyes wide in the darkness, and fixed my gaze on the Osborne fire fender. Its brass form a familiar, solid anchor in a world that had come unmoored. I focused on the intricate lines of the topographic map under the glass, tracing the contours of mountains and valleys I knew by heart, trying to ground myself in a reality that was rapidly slipping away. The scratching continued for what felt like hours, a patient, relentless sound that promised it had all the time in the world. When dawn finally broke, the silence that returned was as sudden as the sound's arrival. I waited a full hour, until the sun was well above the horizon, before I dared to venture out onto the catwalk. My hands trembled as I unlatched the door. The air was crisp and clean. There were no tracks in the dirt around the tower's base. No sign of disturbance. Nothing. The need for water forced me down the trail later that morning. The tower's supply was running low, and the spring was a quarter-mile descent into the subalpine forest. I carried my pack and the empty water jugs, my eyes constantly scanning the trees, my ears attuned to every snap of a twig. It was on my return journey, hauling the heavy, sloshing containers up the steep path, that I saw them. At the base of the tower, growing in the thin, rocky soil, was a patch of wild strawberries. But it wasn't a natural patch. The plants formed a perfect, unbroken circle about 10 feet in diameter, surrounding the concrete footings of my temporary home. The berries themselves were a vibrant, impossible red, glistening with dew, looking juicier and more perfect than any wild fruit I had ever seen. As an ethnobotanist, I recognized the species instantly. Fragaria virginiana, common enough in these parts. But this formation, this flawless geometry, was anything but common. It was a deliberate arrangement, a design. Rule number 7. Never, under any circumstances, consume the wild strawberries that grow in a perfect circle around the base of the tower. They are not for you. My academic mind, the part of me that still clung to reason, was fascinated. I thought of the Salish stories, of plants as sacred gifts, each with its own purpose and protocol. Some plants were for healing, some for ceremony, and some, perhaps, were offerings meant for another, non-human world. They are not for you. The words implied they were for someone, or something else. I felt a sudden, chilling certainty that this perfect circle of fruit was not a garden, but a lure. A plate set for a guest I never wanted to meet. I gave the circle a wide berth and scrambled back up the trapdoor, locking it firmly behind me. That night, I resolved to stay awake. I drank cup after cup of instant coffee, the bitter taste doing little to chase away the bone-deep exhaustion. I sat on the insulated stool in the center of the room, the logbooks and the list of rules spread before me on the desk. The hours ticked by, 2200, 2300, midnight. The wilderness outside was a wall of impenetrable black. It was shortly after 0100 when it happened. I was looking out the western window, my eyes tired and unfocused, when the stars began to disappear. It wasn't clouds rolling in. It was a creeping, spreading void. One by one, the familiar constellations, Ursa Major, Cassiopeia, were extinguished, as if a great, black curtain was being drawn across the cosmos. Within a minute, the sky was gone. There was no moon, no starlight, no residual glow. Just a flat, featureless, absolute blackness that seemed to press against the glass of the windows, sucking all light and life from the world. My breath caught in my chest. My hand flew to the propane lantern on the desk, my fingers fumbling for the striker. Rule number 6. Some nights the stars will seem to go out. This is an atmospheric effect. Do not light the lantern. Sit on the insulated stool and wait for them to return. Do not count the time that passes. My hand recoiled from the lantern as if it were red hot. This is an atmospheric effect. The lie was so blatant, so absurd. It was more terrifying than the truth. This was not weather. This was an event. An uncreation. I scrambled back to the insulated stool, its glass feet suddenly feeling like the most important technology in the world. I sat rigidly, my back straight, my hands clenched into fists on my knees, and stared into the void beyond the windows. Do not count the time. Why? What would happen if I did? Would I notice it stretching, compressing, breaking? I closed my eyes, focusing on the sound of my own frantic heartbeat. The silence was total. No wind, no crickets. Not even the hum of the refrigerator. The soundscape of the world had been erased along with the stars. I don't know how long I sat there. Time had lost all meaning. It could have been 10 minutes or 10 hours. My sense of self began to fray at the edges, my consciousness adrift in a sea of pure, sensory-deprived blackness. Then, as suddenly as it had vanished, the world returned. A single star blinked into existence, then another, then 1,000 more. The familiar tapestry of the Milky Way spilled across the sky. A breath I didn't realize I'd been holding escaped my lungs in a ragged sob. I was shaking uncontrollably, drenched in a cold sweat. It was over. I stumbled to the window, my legs weak, and looked out at the restored night. Everything seemed normal. The familiar peaks were silhouetted against the starlight. I leaned my forehead against the cool glass, dizzy with relief. And then I remembered the first rule. The one I had dismissed as a simple quirk. After sunset, do not look directly at the horizon. Observe it only through reflections in the window panes. With a trembling hand, I shifted my focus from the world outside to my own reflection in the dark glass. I saw my own pale, terrified face. I saw the familiar interior of the cabin behind me, the desk, the bed, the Osborne firefinder, and standing just behind my right shoulder, where there was nothing but empty air in the room itself, was the tall, unmoving figure from the tree line. Time ceased to have meaning. My universe had contracted to the 15 by 15-foot confines of the cabin and the pane of glass in which my own terrified face was superimposed over the silent, watching figure. I didn't dare turn around. The rational part of my mind, the scholar who had once lectured on the power of suggestion and mass hysteria, knew there was nothing there. It was a reflection, a trick of light, and an overstressed mind. But the primal animal part of me, the part that had been awakened on this lonely peak, knew better. It knew that the reflection was the truth, and the empty space behind me was the lie. I spent the night on the insulated stool, a prisoner in the center of my own panopticon. I did not sleep. I watched my spectral companion in the reflection of the darkened windows. It never moved. It simply stood, a tall, patient silhouette, its presence a crushing weight on my sanity. It was a perfect, silent sentinel, and I was its sole object of observation. The rules had inverted my role. I was no longer the lookout, I was the watched. When the first tentative rays of dawn crept over the horizon, the figure in the glass faded, dissolving with the darkness. I was alone again. I stumbled to the cot, my body trembling with exhaustion, and, a relief so profound it felt like physical pain. I fell into a heavy, dreamless sleep that lasted for hours. I awoke in the late afternoon to the familiar, comforting crackle of the radio. It was dispatch running a routine check. Kalispell dispatch to Tama Lookout. Radio check. Over. My throat was dry. I took a moment to compose myself, to force the tremor from my voice. I had to maintain normalcy. To admit what I had experienced would be to admit madness, to be relieved of my post in disgrace. My academic career was in ruins. I would not allow this strange, wild chapter of my life to end the same way. Tama Lookout to Kalispell. I read you 5 by 5. All quiet on the mountain, over. My voice was a stranger's, thin and reedy. Roger that, Tama. Stay safe up there. Dispatch clear. The silence that followed was absolute. The events of the past weeks had been a slow, methodical dismantling of my reality. The anemometer, the weeping on the radio, the scratching, the vanishing stars, each had been a test, a lesson in a curriculum of terror. And I, the diligent student, had learned. The rules were not a prank. They were a set of bylaws for coexisting with something ancient and unknowable. Something that considered this mountain its domain. My gaze fell upon the circle of wild strawberries at the base of the tower. The 7th rule: never, under any circumstances, consume the wild strawberries that grow in a perfect circle around the base of the tower. They are not for you. My ethnobotanist's mind, the last bastion of my old self, began to work. In Salish and Kootenai traditions, plants were not mere resources. They were sacred beings, gifts to be treated with protocol and respect. Offerings were central to maintaining balance. The strawberries, in their perfect, unnatural circle, were not a random occurrence. They were an offering, a sacrament. They are not for you. They were for the guardians of this place. The figure in the reflection, the thing that scratched at my door, the source of the weeping on the wind. And in that moment, a terrible, desperate logic took hold of me. If the offering was the reason for its presence, then removing the offering might break the connection. It was a perversion of every principle of cultural respect I held dear, a violation of the sacred I had dedicated my life to studying. But I was no longer an academic. I was a cornered animal. As dusk began to fall, I made my decision. I would not spend another night with that silent watcher at my back. I took the small can of gasoline for the backup generator, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold it. I descended the trapdoor for what I knew would be the last time. The air at the base of the tower was cold and still. The circle of strawberries seemed to glow in the fading light, each berry a perfect, crimson jewel. I stood at the edge of the circle, the smell of gasoline sharp in my nostrils. I remembered the Salish stories of Coyote, the trickster who made the world safe for humans by defeating the ancient monsters, the Nakiske Lixuntin, the people eaters. But Coyote was not here. I was alone. They are not for you, I whispered, the words tasting like sacrilege on my tongue. And you are not welcome here. I poured the gasoline, the clear liquid darkening the soil, splashing over the perfect berries. I struck a match. The flare of the flame was a tiny, defiant star in the growing darkness. I tossed it onto the circle. The world did not erupt in flame. It erupted in sound. It was a scream that came from everywhere at once. From the trees, from the rocks, from the sky itself. It was the weeping from the radio, the shriek of the wind, the scratching at the door, all amplified into a single, deafening chorus of rage and agony. It was the sound of a covenant being broken, of a sacred trust being violated. I staggered back, clutching my ears, and looked up at the tower. My home, my sanctuary. It was no longer empty. In every window, on all four sides of the cabin, figures were pressed against the glass. Not reflections. They were inside. Dozens of them. Tall, gaunt shapes, their forms indistinct and wavering like heat haze, their faces pale. Featureless discs in the gloom. They were not looking out at the burning offering. They were all looking down at me. My radio, clipped to my belt, crackled to life. It was not dispatch. It was a voice ancient and cold as stone. A voice that spoke with the grinding of mountains and the rustle of a billion dead leaves. It spoke a single word. A name I had read in my research, but never heard spoken. A name from the old Kutanai language, for a creature of legend. A wolf-like thing that carried off dogs and screamed like a human. Shunka Warakan. Then came another voice, a woman's, weeping with a sorrow so profound it hollowed out my soul. And then another, and another. A chorus of the lost, the forgotten, the ones who had come before me and failed the test. My legs gave out. I fell to my knees, my eyes fixed on the burning circle, the smoke acrid in my lungs. I finally understood. The rules were not for survival. They were a recruitment process, a test of obedience. And I had failed. My last coherent thought was of the logbook, of the yellowed, typewritten page. There was space at the bottom. Space for one more rule. I saw the words as clearly as if they were typed before my eyes. A final, damning piece of folklore. My contribution. 8. Do not desecrate the offering. They are hungry, and they do not forgive.